The following is a transcription of the NICAP press conference on the University of Colorado study held at the National Press Club on Tuesday, April 30, 1968. The voice you hear will be that of Major Donald Keyhoe, who conducted the press conference and handled all the questions.
Fact-finding organization with field committees to investigate sightings and several hundred advisors who are scientists, engineers, and experts in other fields. For 17 months, we have cooperated with the Air Force-financed University of Colorado UFO project. We have broken off relations with this project very regrettably, because we have evidence that instead of being the objective, impartial, scientific investigation it was announced to be, it has been extremely negative. The director has revealed a very extreme bias. The coordinator of the project, before the contract was signed, suggested that the project be announced in such a way that it would appear to be objective, whereas actually would be handled in a different manner. Quite a bit of this is covered in our press release. We have sent a report to the President of the United States enclosing evidence of what we term grave deficiencies in this study. The study has cost over $500,000 to date. 2 top scientists have been fired by the head of the project, Dr. Condon, for revealing proposals that the study should be carried out to appear objective, and also explaining how it would actually be handled. The administrative assistant or secretary of the project resigned in protest against the way the project was handled, and also in protest against the firings. During this period of 17 months, we supplied hundreds of reports at the project's request. Some of them, many of them, from such competent observers as veteran pilots, scientists, aerospace engineers, and other responsible witnesses. We also, at the project's request, briefed them on some of these hoaxes and occasional wild tales that you read about, so that they could be prepared to distinguish between the serious reports and the other type. In the field, we helped investigate quite a number of cases and gave them our evaluations. This went on until the spring of '67, when we began to notice Dr. Condon making statements to the press in which he was quoted as saying, among other things, "This is a crazy business. I don't believe the UFOs exist. I think the government should get out of this business," and so on. In case any of you care to see them, we have copies of some of these clips. Dr. Condon always told me afterward that he was misquoted, and that very well could be, but he was always misquoted in one direction. In September, he made a speech before scientists out at Gaithersburg, atomic scientists, very high-level professionals, in which he made fun of the subject and indicated that it was pure nonsense. We had a report on that from one of the scientists who was present. When we complained, there was no real explanation given, and we stopped sending information. We still allowed our subcommittees to help with investigations. However, the project urged that we resume sending information. Mr. Lowe, the coordinator, came to Washington and said that they depended on us for most of their information, that it was of very high caliber, and he put this in writing, and urged that we resume transmissions as soon as possible. Our answer was that we would send several questions to him and Dr. Condon, and if the answers were satisfactory, that we would then resume cooperation. These questions included queries about our reports. We asked Dr. Condon if he had examined any of the hundreds of NICAP reports, if he intended to examine any of them, if he had ever made any field investigations, or if he intended to. We asked also whether the project was being carried out as it was publicly announced in an impartial, scientific manner. The same questions were addressed to Mr. Lowe. Both men wrote back and refused to answer. Shortly after that, Dr. David Saunders, who was head of the computer section, gave me privately a copy of a memorandum which Mr. Lowe had drawn up just before, or sometime before, the project contract was signed. Now, part of that is quoted in the press release, but the main points are here are some of the main points. In order to undertake such a project, one has to approach it objectively. That is, one has to admit the possibility that such things as UFOs exist. It is not respectable to give serious consideration to such a possibility. Believers, in other words, remain outcasts. Then he goes on down a little bit farther. The simple act of admitting these possibilities, just as possibilities, puts us beyond the pale, and we would lose more in prestige in the scientific community than we could possibly gain by undertaking the investigation. Now, he there quotes the opinions of a number of members of the faculty, and this memorandum was sent, incidentally, to Vice President Thurston E. Manning, who signed the final contract. Now, down farther, Mr. Lowe states his own suggestions for handling the project. He says, our study would be conducted almost exclusively by non-believers who, although they couldn't possibly prove a negative result, could and probably would add an impressive body of evidence that there is no reality to the observations. The trick would be, I think, to describe the project so that to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. Then he goes on and says the best way to do this would be to stress investigation of the witnesses. Psychologists find out why they report seeing flying saucers or UFOs. That if the emphasis were put here, rather than on the old question of physical reality, that is the actual evidence, I think the scientific community would quickly get the message. Now, these private proposals were circulated, although Dr. Condon later stated that he never saw them until February of this year, but they were circulated widely. And certainly one copy went to to Vice President Manning, who later signed the contract. Now, in the contract, which is public, the proposals of the project are incorporated, so they are a part of the contract. And it says, the work will be conducted under conditions of the strictest objectivity by investigators who, as carefully as can be determined, have no predilections or preconceived positions on the UFO question. This is essential if the public, the Congress, the executive, and the scientific community are to have confidence in the study. Now, these are diametrically opposed, so that we have some people in the project, certainly the coordinator, who believes that you should approach it negatively, but the public should be convinced that you're being very careful and very scientific. Now, I am not, and NICAP does not at any time state or imply or believe that Dr. Condon or Mr. Lowe were or are dishonest about this. Both of them seem to believe that it was correct to take the attitudes they did. Dr. Condon is a distinguished scientist, and he has stated from the start that he did not believe in these things. And more, he made this public, this attitude, which was extremely biased, and caused a number of people to tell us not to report their findings to Colorado. A group of scientists, including Dr. David Saunders and Dr. Norman Levine, actually the majority of the scientists, tried their very best to offset this and get a positive approach. They protested in one 3-hour session with Dr. Condon and Mr. Lowe that this was the wrong way to approach the subject, and it should be made completely objective. There was no change in the policy, which was to work toward a negative conclusion. Now this particular memo was given to me late in 1967. I kept it secret, except from my assistant director, Mr. Gordon Lohr, because Saunders asked us not to mention it as long as there was any hope of restoring a neutral approach or attaining a neutral approach. However, a copy was later given to Dr. James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona. He got permission from Saunders to mention the fact to Condon or Lowe that he did have it. I argued against that because I thought we should wait until the last possible minute if there was any hope. But when Lowe received word of this, he exploded and Condon exploded. Condon fired Saunders and Levine immediately. He stated publicly to the press in a signed press release that they were being discharged for incompetence. They were being discharged for having put out this memorandum. Dr. Condon wrote to the president of the University of Arizona and insisted that he order McDonald to return what he called the stolen papers. The president put it up to McDonald, and McDonald refused. Condon wrote McDonald and again insisted that he return the, quote, stolen papers, and McDonald said he would refuse to do it. After this time, and the men were fired, it was decided to break this out in the open. I had expected to do it through NICAP publications, but I agreed that if they wanted to do it through a big magazine, it was all right. So we gave part of our information to Look, which has the story in the present issue. There's a box statement in there which sums up NICAP's operations and our position. Now, we have never objected to the possibility of a negative conclusion as long as the evidence was being examined. And if it had been, we would have had no complaint at all. But the bad result of all this publicity now is going to be that many people will not only lose confidence in the Colorado project, particularly since Coordinator Lowe is the one drawing up the final report, but they will lose confidence in any officially sponsored investigation from now on. So we have just submitted to the President of the United States all of the evidence I've mentioned and others, including copies of letters from Dr. Condon and Mr. Lowe, and asked him to consider creating a special commission which would be completely independent of any military or civilian agency. It would be composed of a number of scientists, authorities in various fields such as electronics, aerospace planning and engineering, and UFO investigations. Some of them have, such as Dr. McDonald. And it would be, as much as possible, the same level as which the Colorado project was supposed to operate. Men with no preconceived opinions. At least men who are willing to have an open mind and look at the evidence. To further safeguard the operations, there would be regular interim reports. All major decisions would be made by a majority vote so that no one man could control the commission. There are other steps that we are suggesting, but we're waiting for advice from a number of scientists who aid NICAP, and also from outside scientists who have begun to send in their suggestions after reading the Look article. Now, NICAP has offered the President its full cooperation. We will turn over all of our reports, except for a fraction of 1%, where the witnesses have insisted that their names be kept confidential. But we will urge these witnesses. Some of them are on active duty in the military forces, or are people with large defense contracts. We will urge them to turn over their reports to this commission if it's created on a confidential basis. We will increase the number of field subcommittees, and we will make their efforts available to this commission so that they need not have an enormous number of investigators, although it would be good if they did have a number of roving teams. And we will cooperate in any way possible, and we also are suggesting to the President that it might be well to examine the people who have been on the project to see where it got off the track. Now, the general situation is this. More and more people have begun to accept the possibility that these objects are real. According to Gallup polls, about 46% of the public, while they do not accept the idea that they're interplanetary, they do think they are real objects and not hallucinations. This has been a problem for many years, and it has become increasingly serious because more and more people have been reporting close approaches by these objects. Quite a number of people have reported that their cars have been closely approached. Airline pilots have sometimes made very sharp evasions to keep from being hit by one, and over 100 passengers have been hurt over a period of years in either quick dives or zooms when there was no time to flash a seatbelt sign. This thing should be opened up and all of the secrecy removed. Now, there is secrecy, despite the denials. We have here a few copies of the old Project Grudge reports, which all of them are stamped confidential or secret. We managed to get the most committee to work on it, and finally the secrecy lid was removed from that group of cases. But there are orders at present for people in the Air Force not to discuss any sightings at all, except base commanders who may reveal them to the press if the sighting has been explained as a conventional object. Now, the Air Force is in a spot. They are acting under higher level orders, and we're not criticizing the Air Force but the policy. And what we hope will be the net result from this Colorado fiasco is that people will be more aware of the confusion and the attempts to keep this covered up, and will insist on an end to it. So we'll get, whether we get all of the answers, we don't know, but at least we'll get all of the available answers, and they'll be given to the press, the public, and Congress. Now, I'll be glad to try to answer any questions you may have on this subject.
Major, has Dr. Condon talked to you since this story came out in the book?
No, sir, he has not. But I can tell you that he was, he had a telephone message from a well-known columnist here in Washington. It was the first word he had of it. And the word came back that he was stunned by it. Since then, he has communicated with the publishers of Look magazine and said that he demands a conference with him. He has to communicate with us. We have not talked with anyone since about a week or two after the firings of the two people because of the situation. They said it was best for reason. They had a lawyer who advised them not to talk with anybody about it, so we made no attempt to break that. But we have many small details that add up to this picture to show that, unfortunately, this project never had a chance from the start. Yes, sir.
Major Keyhoe, in your official publication, the UFO Investigator, the March-April 1967 issue, which was just a year ago,
you were talking about the University of Colorado study, and you said, considering the complexity and the controversial nature of the UFO mystery, the project has shown admirable objectivity and thoroughness in working out a methodology while maintaining a flexibility and open-mindedness suitable to the situation. And then you went on to say the only event which might force NICAP to withdraw its support would be evidence that outside pressures were causing the project to retreat from objective scientific investigation. Do you now charge that there were outside pressures on the University of Colorado?
No, sir, I do not. And I think you will agree, and I imagine almost everyone will agree, that sometimes circumstances cause you to change your mind. At that time, that was in March, that the material for that was written before the issue was dated. But we were fairly well convinced by our meetings and discussions out there and the constant conferences here at NICAP headquarters that this was being done very carefully, very well. We talked with some of the field teams, and it looked like an honest investigation in which Dr. Condon would finally be convinced in spite of his first views. I have not found any evidence of any Air Force pressure which caused this switch. I think it is an internal result. I think the Air Force was aware that there was a negative approach, and they probably, just as we were, they must have become more aware of it. But I am not criticizing Air Force for this present situation. And I'm sorry that we've had to break, because it could have been an extremely fine thing to get this out. It would have led to a much greater investigation. They didn't have a big enough force to do a full-scale job. And I could show you letters here in which they said without our help they never could have even gotten the thing off the ground. And they praised us. Dr. Condon and Lowe both praised us for our work. We would have been glad to keep on if they stayed in the middle of the road.
Was NICAP invited to participate with the university, or did you volunteer?
No, sir. We were invited. The contract states in there that they will confer with the Air Force and with such private organizations as the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. They got in touch with us, and we immediately stated that we'd be very glad. Then they sent Mr. Lowe to Washington. We conferred with him, Dr. Saunders, and then we finally went out to Boulder and had a full-scale discussion.
In your judgment, has Blue Book maintained a completely hands-off attitude?
No, sir. Well, the main thing they have not done, they have not supplied all the cases that were asked for. Dr. Saunders asked if we could supply certain cases going back into the early days, which they had asked for, but the Air Force had not supplied. I had some of them that were cleared for me way back in 52 and 3. Blue Book frequently said they couldn't supply them because their files were messed up and they couldn't locate, particularly a lot of the 1952 cases. I also know of cases which occurred as recently as the spring of 67, which were never reported to Boulder and never been made public.
Sir, you said that the Air Force now is under orders not to discuss any UFOs except those that can be explained.
Yes, sir. Now that's in Air Force Regulation 8017, which replaces the old AFR 200-2.
And then that you didn't really quibble with the Air Force because they were under pressure from higher up. What is higher up?
Well, I will say this, that that's not the President. The President does not set the policy, but agencies high enough that they have power over all intelligence gathering activities.
Would we be specific?
All right, the CIA is involved in it, the National Security Council. The CIA says that it takes its orders from the NSC, though I don't know that that's true. In that case, the National Security Council has to be involved, but the CIA has been connected with this over a long period of time, since 1953.
Major Keyhoe, you referred to stolen papers.
Yes, sir.
Now, these are papers that came from the files out there that, if I understand you, were taken by Dr. Saunders and by Dr. Levine without the knowledge of Dr. Condon or the project coordinator. And if I understand you, is this correct, that they, without telling them, they took papers from the files, brought them to you or mailed them to you, and they also gave them to Dr. McDonald, and didn't they have a secret meeting with McDonald and Hynek at Denver? This according to the Look article. Is all this true?
Not exactly, because Mr. Lowe has put it in writing, and it's quoted in that article, that there must be no classification or restriction on any material or any files of the UFO project, that it would not be ethical.
Well,
and
now
he listed that, and this was in what they listed as the open files. Now this, to go way back on this, this memo was originally discovered by one of the project staff members.
which one, do you know?
Yes, but I'm not allowed to say. But however,
Dr.
it's
Levine.
information. No, it was not any of the scientists, but it was quickly, the word was quickly passed on to the others, so that practically all of the scientists knew about it, but they didn't come and complain to Condon because they didn't think it was going to do any good. They thought the best way to do was to work to try to get the thing into at least a neutral approach. These are not, he used the word stolen. If these papers were in the open files, then they weren't stolen. I will admit that Condon had reason to be considerably annoyed when he found that they'd been turned over to a man who'd been criticizing, not me, to Dr. McDonald. I don't know whether he knows to this day that I had a copy. And I had no intention of using it, although I was strongly tempted a couple of times when things were going so badly, but I gave my word to Dr. Saunders and the rest of the group that it would not be used without their permission.
Well, Major Keyhoe, your own NICAP files are not classified. You're not involved in any military work. What would you do if one of your employees were to go through the files and take certain papers out and give them to me or give them to the Air Force without your knowledge?
I'd probably fire him.
You'd probably fire him, which is what happened.
It would depend on what it was. If it was something...
But just as a matter of principle, the files in your office belong to NICAP, and if somebody wants to send them to someone who is unfriendly to NICAP, or might be unfriendly, you would take a rather dim view of their doing it.
I would take a dim view of the disloyalty rather than probably the papers. Now, there is one small group, which I've already mentioned, of papers that is not open to anybody. We have reports from, I would say they probably don't number over 50 to 75 reports from people who don't want their names used and insist. Some of them will not even send in the report before we write back and say we agree, keep your name confidential, and not to identify the sighting in such a way that it can be recognized, traced back. Now those things are not to be given out by anybody. Although I frequently ask these people if they will release them, if they would release them in a group, for instance.
Is there a
But
pattern?
that's the only group. Yes,
Is there a pattern of reason why these people don't want to be identified?
One group of sightings came from a number of scientists at a laboratory which has had at that time a very high government defense contracts, and they were afraid it might interfere with their standing. Some of them come from people who are afraid that it would affect their standing in the community. Now, there have been too many cases of witnesses who've reported these things publicly and have been ridiculed afterwards, including Air Force pilots. There was a case quite a long time ago of an Air Force colonel, famous wing commander known as the outstanding fighter of World War II, Colonel Donald J.M. Blakesley, made a very, very detailed report, and it was accepted as a UFO report, but when it became public, it was stated that he was misled by looking at the planet Jupiter. Now, this thing was being tracked by radar at the very same time, with a radar station range of approximately 300 miles, and Jupiter was 366 million miles from the Earth. It was impossible for it to be tracked by radar. But this man was ridiculed just the same, so that's why many people...
Do you feel this has been a conspiracy from the very beginning with the CIA, the Air Force, right from the very beginning of the Volta project, or is it something that, let's say, got started after the Volta project was
You mean a conspiracy from the beginning of the project? You're not going back beyond that? No, I'll tell you what happened. The Air Force was in a bad spot because of all that publicity, particularly over the marsh gas explanation. And many people, a great deal of press rejected that, so that they, had been suggested before by Heine that they have a more scientific investigation, and this advisory group in the Office of Scientific Research recommended it, and it seemed like a very good thing, and also to those who were on the spot, it was a good out, because there would be a lull, there would be a moratorium during that time. And I'll admit, I was dubious, because I thought, well, as long as the Air Force is paying for it, surely they have some control. But then after meeting these men, I believe they're independent. Condon said, the Air Force is not going to tell me what to do. If I find out they're hiding anything, why, I'll certainly let them have it. It was just about those words. But here in a newspaper statement, he says in here, it doesn't matter much to me whether the Air Force is hiding anything or not. He says, I don't care. Of course, that may have been another statement, which was a misquotation. But I don't think so. I think that the thing grew. I think the Air Force hoped that the Condon group would come in with a negative answer, and that possibly knowing his position as an agnostic, they felt that there was a good chance that they would come in with that report. But there was no, as far as I know, no high-level pressure of any kind put on it. And I think that the whole trouble here has grown out of the attitude of Mr. Lowe and Dr. Condon.
Sir, have you ever seen a flying saucer?
No, ma'am. I have been over in the control room of Washington National Airport. I was there during that big excitement way back in the 50s when they were being tracked by radar, and I saw them maneuvering in groups and slowing down and then speeding up, in one case from practically zero up to 7,200 miles an hour. All of this was reported by the then CAA, but I have not seen one. Matter of fact, if I saw one, I would never admit it unless there were about 15,000 highly competent witnesses there and newsreel photographs and everything else, because I'd rather be considered a reporter than an investigator. I don't want to be somebody who is proceeding on the basis of a conviction based on what he's seen.
Has it ever appeared in any other shape than a saucer?
Yes, and the major of sightings, and this is from the Air Force report, are disc-shaped objects with a diameter 10 times their thickness at the center. The second group listed by the Air Force, and the old Project Grudge report, was rocket or cigar-shaped objects, sometimes described as having an exhaust trail. Then there are other shapes that have been seen, sometimes probably were misidentification of ordinary objects and all sorts of peculiar things that have been described since then, which could be illusions, so on. But the main shape is a disc-shaped object, and that's been seen by so many hundreds of pilots, military and commercial airline, private, not only here but abroad, and by control tower operators, tracked on radar, with radar scopes actually showing changes in formation. That it seems fairly well verified, and incidentally, most of those radar scope photos are by Air Force order immediately classified. That's in Air Force Order 8017.
Do you think they're interplanetary?
I do indeed, ma'am, because the Air Force has had a top secret estimate of the situation saying this for years. And they have denied it frequently, but then again they turn around occasionally and someone in the Pentagon admits it. Captain Ruppel was once head of the project, was the first one to make that public. I already had heard of it through two officers in the Directorate of Intelligence. But of course they could change their minds. But at one time, the entire project out there at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was convinced these things were interplanetary.
Could you give us a summary of attitudes and activities by other governments in the world on UFOs?
The rest of the world?
Yes, other governments in the world.
They have changed sometimes too. Now, for a while, Great Britain was releasing its official sightings, and we had quite a number of them. And then in 1957 or 8, we asked for copies of sightings, which they had admitted to the newspapers. It just did, and they said they had adopted a new policy, and these things were under classification. Norway, the same thing. They said theirs were under classification. Brazilian Air Force at one time came out with a strong public statement saying they urged all the governments of the world to get together and pool their information. Then all of a sudden they stopped talking, and you can't get very much out of them. Argentina has approached us and asked for our official help in an investigation, and they're quite open about their sightings. We've had a number of reports they've given us from their Navy pilots. Let's see, Russia, until recently, alternately denied that these things existed or blamed them on the United States. Then suddenly there was a change, and one of their top scientists came out and said that they had many reports, and he released some of them. Observations by scientists and aircraft pilots and so on, of objects up to even in one case up to 1,680 feet across from tip to tip. A number of them where they estimated the size as anywhere from 325 to 500 feet. Well, then Moscow announced the establishment of a UFO project. All of a sudden, everything was reversed, and although they haven't announced it, I believe the project has been abandoned. And now Pravda is attacking these reports that were put out by one of their own top scientists. But
pardon me, Major Keyhoe, it was not a top scientist. He teaches celestial navigation in an aviation institute, and the Soviet Academy of Sciences has issued a formal statement saying there is absolutely no evidence in support of the extraterrestrial. Well, I'm Mr. Klass, and I think we ought to set the record straight.
Well, I have all of the documents on it. We have, he is not any mediocre scientist. He has more of the background by than teaching astronomy.
He is not one of their top scientists, according to the Soviet Academy.
It's a question of who is the top scientist and who decides.
He's not a member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Let's get that on the record.
Well, let's say that these reports that he passed on were reports from these men who exist. They're astronomers at observatories, and surely all the astronomers in the Russian observatories are not mediocre. But I'm not here to argue the Russian reports. I was asked if they were what the world situation was. I say Russia's situation is constantly confusing, which doesn't surprise me. But I believe now that the average, it's about 50-50. Half of the countries in the world will say that they're getting reports, and the others won't say anything.
Tell us who John Fuller is.
John Fuller is an author who came to us about an incident at Exeter which occurred back in '65, a very well documented sighting, and we gave him all information. He went up and rechecked our investigators' path and obtained the same information and wrote a book, Incident at Exeter. He later, I'm sorry to say, wrote a book called Interrupted Journey, which was the story of a couple in New Hampshire who stated under hypnosis to a very well-known psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist, that they had been taken aboard a spaceship and been given physical examination. Well, we knew about that had known about it for years and been trying very hard to keep it from coming out because we thought any of these rather preposterous stories have a bad effect on serious investigation. It was a very interesting story the way it's written, and it even frightened a number of women.
How did he get to do that story?
I don't know. No, I wouldn't have given it to anyone because I still was hoping that they could do something
How
with
did
it.
he get the
Well, I can't prove it, but since he got the information, he must have gotten it from the men who were discharged out there. I can't figure out how he could have gotten any of the details.
You called it a preposterous story. Do you believe it or not?
I don't believe it. The one about there being taken aboard this
Yes.
thing? No, we had a very competent investigator. He's a lecturer in astronomy at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. He checked into this case over a period of about 3 years at intervals, and he said he thinks they actually saw something which frightened them, and the rest of it was a case of being disturbed and having bad dreams and so on, and they were hypnotized once, and then they later went into this other session, and I don't accept it. NICAP does not accept it. We know of no case where we accept the evidence that anyone's been taken aboard a spaceship.
Who was that investigator, Major?
Beg
Who
pardon?
was that investigator?
John, the one who wrote the story, John Fuller, the author.
The one who investigated the people who...
Wally Webb.
Webb, yeah, of the Post.
Could you tell us, sir, how you know the CIA has issued the orders to the Air Force not to discuss?
Dr. McDonald, now I knew this back in '53 because I was in the Pentagon the day that the CIA held their session and said these things would have to be debunked. But I had been working with a group of Air Force officers who thought the best thing to do was to give out what they had without any conclusion because they didn't have any final conclusion themselves. And that was stopped. But the Air Force, the CIA asked for this debunking program, and that's what's been carried out for a long time. It's a matter of policy.
52, did you say?
I beg pardon?
1952?
1953, this was January. It's been, this has been mentioned before. It's not any story, not news. 2 or 3 people have mentioned it. Dr. McDonald out at Wright Field saw the actual order, he says, and later asked for a copy, which they told him he could have, but later afterward they found that they weren't allowed to give it to him. But the reason was that they thought that it was all these reports coming in might have a distracting effect during some crisis, some war, threatened invasion crisis or something like that.
Dr. Keyhoe, excuse me, Mr. Keyhoe, do you believe that your organization is any more objective than the University of Colorado team?
Yes, sir, I do, for this reason. We have on our Board of Governors men who agree about the withholding of information, but do not agree that these things are interplanetary. One of them, for instance, is Dr. Olivier, the president of the American Meteor Society, who says that it's wrong to withhold information and ridicule witnesses, but that this could be an important matter and it should be gone into very carefully and openly. We have scientists and engineers on our list of advisors who will say approximately the same thing, that they are convinced that this is truly a serious problem, but they don't come out with any answer. Now, I am on record, before I ever went into NICAP, as accepting this interplanetary answer because I had talked with too many people in the Air Force and I knew about this top secret estimate. And I had talked with many, many pilots and tower people and others. They were either all wrong, and in fact, as a friend of mine, Admiral Farney, former head of Navy Guided Missiles, who's a Naval Academy classmate of mine, and he said, well, either these things are real, and this is really happening, or we better ground about 200 Navy and Marine Corps pilots in a hurry. We got the reports, and they were more than that. Admiral Bolster also said that it was a matter that was receiving more serious consideration than most people realize. He was head of naval research at that time.
Major Keyhoe, how can you claim to be objective? You reviewed my book offering a new explanation for UFOs in your last issue without even having seen the book, let alone reading it, and you proceeded to warn your readers, your members, that there were many errors in the book, yet you didn't even have the title of the book correctly, and the title is on every other page. Now, and you said there were many errors.
I have read the book. Now,
but at the time you wrote that, you had not, had you?
Yes, I had. I didn't sit down and study every little word.
You didn't even look at the title of the book when you wrote the review?
That was a typographical error, and in copying this over and writing an article, did you know there is another book out with an actual title?
Well, that's your mistake, not mine. Don't blame me for this.
But anyway, I say I will stick by what I said, that there are many errors in your book, but I'm not here to discuss the ball lightning theory. I believe Dr. McDonald's criticism, and he is an atmospheric physicist and a very distinguished and experienced one, and I think his criticisms are valid, and as soon as we have spaceport, I was going to put some of his criticism in the next issue, but this present situation may defer that. I will admit to the error in transposing the title of your book.
Transposing it was completely wrong.
You really got it backward, that's all.
No, and there were...
Well, anyway, I will admit the title.
I have copies for anybody who'd like to see his report, his review, and then you can judge how objective NICAP is.
Well, sir, 1 minute. I'm going to make one statement, then I will not discuss take up the time of these correspondence with your theory today, but you came into the NICAP office after your first article in your magazine, Aviation Week, and told Assistant Director Hall, and there were other witnesses there, that you had really no interest in this subject until about 3 weeks before you published that you had accepted Dr. Mensel's views, but then when you looked into it, you discovered the answer. And you had spent approximately 3 weeks before you found the answer. Well, now, I had been on a long time. I may not, I have, for instance, a Bachelor of Science degree. I don't claim to be a scientist, but I studied it, and I understand a little bit about evidence. I had read the Air Force evaluations, and it amazed me that in 3 weeks you could discover something that everyone else had overlooked. However, I still think that you honestly believe this, but you came out and in your 3 weeks study said that you had explained all of the cases in our voluminous report.
If you will read my articles in my book, you'll see that I made no such claim. I made a tape recording of this interview to which he refers. There was no such statement.
Well, Mr. Klass, I'll be glad to discuss this with you at length at another time, but I did not come here to discuss it.
I merely question your claim to objectivity.
I am objective to this extent. If someone brings me a case proving that he has been aboard a spaceship and it can be proved, I will be objective enough to accept it and to make it public. I have never seen such a case. I have seen enough evidence, the same as if I were a doctor and somebody proved to me there was such a thing as cholera. I'd say, yes, I accept the fact there is cholera. I'm not going to talk about ball lightning anymore this afternoon.
Good.
Sir, what has been the most recent sighting of a UFO, and would you tell us about that?
We get a number that are routine. This has been the latest airline report. Do you remember? There have been foreign airline reports.
There hasn't been a good airline report in some time.
Well, going back a few months, we could pick up some there that, see, the British European Airways, there was a sighting over Spain by this captain who up to that time said he had been a complete skeptic, and this object caught up with him and paced the plane for a while and then went out of sight at much higher speed than go back a little bit more.
Are they increasing or decreasing?
It's hard hard to tell because the lid is down on the military sightings enough so that we get very few leaks. We used to get a lot of them. There may be many we don't know about. The number from other sources seems to be about the same or down a little bit. But there's no connection with any particular time of the year. Now, lots of people have said that these things vary with the seasons, and that's been proved untrue. The Air Force plotted cycles have shown that they vary sometimes more in the winter, sometimes spring. It doesn't make any difference about the time of year. Yes.
First, can you tell me where NICAP derives its financial support? And secondly,
CIA.
You mentioned earlier that you would have been willing to accept an objective conclusion that UFOs, I guess an objective negative conclusion that UFOs affect the bodies. Would you tell me the second answer?
Second answer first?
No, well,
All right, the first answer about the support.
Would accept as objective.
All right, sure. About the first, this is a subscription or a membership organization, but as with many such, memberships do not cover all the cost of operation, and we have several. Oh, we also have this document called the UFO Evidence. It brings the reports up to the 1st of 64, listing about 750 cases, various witnesses, pilots, and some of the others that I mentioned. That, and then occasionally some member who was able to do so helps us out when we're in the spot, which has happened occasionally.
In other words, you're just a group of people.
We're a group. We're under that right now. That covers all 50 states and quite a number of foreign countries. And we publish a membership bulletin every 2 months.
Is that the extent of the services that you render for this membership?
That's right, except for special bulletins. Well, a lot of them write in for answers to specific questions. And although it's almost impossible to answer all of that, sometimes we've had as many as 2,000 letters a day come in there. But we then take the most frequently asked questions and publish answers to those. I think
How much are
$5 a year. I reduced them in order to try to get a better membership around the country, and somebody told me it was a very bad move. But at any rate, we performed other services. We have given information to a number of scientists who are conducting private investigations. For instance, Dr. McDonald has gone through hundreds and hundreds of our files. Educational groups, colleges, and it's not merely limited to our membership. Our hope has been to get this out in the open so there will be enough public interest that they will insist on a complete investigation, at which time, as far as I'm concerned, I'll be glad to get back to writing on other subjects, because it's a very much of an ordeal. Yes, the second question, what would I accept? Why would I accept it? Well, I don't mean I would be happy about it, but I would not claim that this had been unfair, any conniving or anything of the kind. I'd simply say, well, they have looked at the evidence, and it has not convinced them. They were honest about it. All right.
Well, what I mean is, what will convince you? Nothing, I presume.
No, knowing what I have seen and having seen enough Air Force material and talked with people on up, well, rank of colonel of intelligence in the directorate, and many Air Force pilots and airline pilots have seen these things, formation and so on. I would not be convinced by their answer, but I would not have taken issue with it except to say that I had believed that they would be convinced, but we would have kept on trying.
And in other words, what you're arguing in this whole case here is that they are not being objective, not so much that you don't agree with what they are.
What I am against is that they did not examine the evidence. Dr. Condon did not. Mr. Lowe had put that on record. Dr. Saunders said that he never made a single field investigation of any kind, and that he never interviewed any of the witnesses. Well, you cannot very well examine a subject without either getting written testimony, examining, or talking with people.
How many field investigations have you made in the past year, Major Keyhoe, yourself?
About 5, and I have made a great many by telephone and...
What were those 5, for
There's
example?
3 of them I don't care to mention because one group consists of the sightings which the Air Force did not report to the Colorado.
Well, could you mention the 2 or 3 that you did investigate? Where were they located?
I'm not going to lead you in any ball lightning this afternoon.
No, I'm merely...
No,
I mean,
I'm
you're
not.
criticizing Dr. Condon. I was just curious how much field work you do.
Well, that has nothing to do with it.
But you're head of a large UFO
I am
investigating
not,
group.
I am not stating something publicly and then reversing it and acting in a different way behind the scenes, although he hasn't acted differently. He started out at the beginning and said he didn't believe in it and said so more and more, and he doesn't believe in it. But what I think is that no man who has that attitude should have been appointed the head of a supposedly neutral project.
What?
Each of these sightings, a large number, have been thoroughly investigated. I believe that's true.
I beg pardon?
Most of the sightings have been thoroughly investigated with reports either by the military or by your organization.
It depends on the quality of the report. Now, you'll get a telephone call from someone, sometimes a long-distance call. Someone will say, I saw a strange light last night. You ask a few questions.
But there are a large number that have.
That's right. By especially responsible witnesses.
Then point the question that in the lapse of time, why wouldn't a study of these reports be almost as valid as going back and asking people to recall things over a period of several years? You contend that Dr. Condon was not objective because he didn't go out on the side, I guess, on the spot and talk to the people and look at the spot.
Or have the witness brought to it.
But it would seem if the reports are valid, what is to be served?
I'm talking about the recent reports. I don't mean the old ones. He could there rely on the investigations by some of the staff who did go out and check on a number of the older reports. But he didn't even check on any of the new ones.
How active was his staff?
Dr. Saunders went out frequently. Dr. Levine, the other one who was discharged.
Is that unusual that you have staff people doing it?
Well, they were assigned as investigators, but Dr. Condon, when the contract was named as the #1 principal investigator. So you would think that he would have made some.
Doesn't strike me as being particularly unusual.
No, but if he'd examined, he could have stayed in his office and examined best detailed reports, which were presented to him by the staff, and they say these, in our opinion, these are the top. This is top evidence, but he didn't.
Which is almost a normal way of handling such an investigation.
Well, now these scientists out there were intelligent people, and they would have not have objected so violently and taken such risks as they did opposing his policy if they hadn't believed that he was quite wrong. There wasn't any personal dislike of Dr. Condon at all.
There wasn't a report there. Was a report issued by Dr. Condon?
Not yet. The report is supposed to be drawn up. It's actually going to be written by Coordinator Lowe, and it's supposed to go then to the National Academy of Sciences, and they will review it, and it will then go to the Air Force.
What does it say?
I would assume from the present situation that it will probably be negative.
Substantiated?
I don't know. I only know that, the administrative secretary, after she resigned in protest against all this, said that Mr. Lowe was drawing up the report, that she was working with him and knew a great deal about it, and that it was as negative, it was making it as negative as possible. Now, I don't know, I've not seen a word of it.
Seems
and I don't.
like the prejudging until a report then.
That's right. But here's a man who said, he's the one who suggested that this thing be made to appear objective, when actually it wouldn't be.
But in your prejudgment before a report is issued, wouldn't that fall along the same yardstick of objectivity?
Yes, it might, except for the fact that there are no scientists left. The thing is down to a skeleton basis now, and there's hardly, I don't know of any of those who had neutral or positive views who remain.
The mechanics of being written and released are unusual. May I ask one last question?
Yes, sir.
What is the purpose of your press conference?
The purpose of this press conference is to straighten out some misunderstandings, telephone calls and other queries that have come in as a result of the Look article. Now, I have a box statement in there which I summed up the fact that we cooperated and that we continued to cooperate even after we found that Dr. Condon was apparently quite biased, and that we reluctantly broke off. Pardon?
Aren't you having to presume that he's going to be biased before you read the report?
Presume that he'll be what?
Biased.
I said I was quiet. I said I had kept quiet a long time on it.
I thought I understood you to say that one of the purposes of this press conference was to explain the Look article and also
Explain certain questions about it, misunderstandings. We have a number of members who want to know why we kept silent about this so long.
And why Dr. Condon was so biased in his report.
We've had members write to us and say, we've read this, and it looks as though Dr. Condon is not even looking at the evidence. He's biased. Why do you keep on giving him information? We've even had board members and advisors and scientists ask us
What's
this.
going to happen?
But we thought maybe
comes out and substantiates the fact that they are UFOs.
Sir, on that day, I will present Dr. Condon with I don't know what it would be, but whatever I could afford, something or other, and just a gesture. The man's honest, he's not going to because he doesn't believe in them.
Prejudging going on apparently eminent.
Well, he has said repeatedly in his press statements, and he said to us that he didn't know, had not yet seen any evidence that would convince him that these things were real at all. If we had been wanting to criticize Dr. Condon, we could have done so long ago. We stayed away from it as long as we could, hoping that this project would be successful.
Do you mean that you had inside information from these staff members who took the papers and the files, that they have been leaking information to you for many months before this? Is this what you're...
They didn't leak information. They merely said that they had been discussing with Dr. Condon the problems of the approach, and they were having constant arguments about trying to make it at least more objective.
Did it occur to them...
Not leaking papers.
No, but they were, in other words, these same staff members have been talking to you for many months, telling you that all was not going well.
Talking with us. Lowe told me that there was a great deal of dissent in the project. He said that, when was it, last October, when he came in to try to get us to resume transmitting information. He said, well, I'll admit there's a lot of dissent. And he said...
When did you first learn of that and through what sources?
Oh, I would say it was long around April or perhaps May of '67. It was fairly certain. It seemed likely before then from what he was saying to the newspapers. But at that time was when the scientists began to split. A few that were negative and the majority that were on the positive side.
Sir, for our edification, would you tell us how you initially got into this? For some of
Yes, sir. I used to write on a variety of subjects. I was writing aviation articles and espionage expose for True magazine and others. And True asked me to investigate this, and I thought it was a big joke. And I said, we'll investigate, you can pay me, but I don't want my name connected with it. But after spending about 7 or 8 months on it and talking with these two admirals, classmates of mine, who told me the Navy and Marine Corps reports they had, and then seeing some of the evidence, and the Air Force was a little more open at that time, I thought, well, this is really important.
When did this occur, sir?
This was way back in 49 and 50.
Were you?
I was a freelance writer having a happy, pleasant life, and let's say a lot more lucrative one too. But no matter what happens to me or to NICAP, this problem is not going to die down suddenly. It's eventually going to have to be brought out into the open and settled.
When did you retire from service?
Well, I had a crash in the Pacific one night. That was way before World War II. Then I went back on duty in World War II and was automatically retired at the end of that, shortly after the end of World War II.
What do you charge for your lectures, Major Keyhoe? We've been privileged to hear it for free, but what do you normally charge for your lectures on UFOs?
You asked me to lecture for some group, and I'll give you a price on it.
I see. Out in
I'll
Kansas
say
City.
this, sir.
Yes.
My income is at present about 1/6 of what I was making as a freelance writer and lecturer before I went to NICAP, and I have frequently been in debt because of staying on this thing, and I am not making any money.
You've written 4 books, and you've...
If you have, well, for your book, you will find out when you're through paying the income tax on it, you probably will not have made much of it. No, I was, if I were interested more in the dollar, I would have been out of NICAP long ago.
And you do not draw a salary from
I draw a
NICAP?
salary, I certainly do.
Oh, you do?
I draw what I consider a picayune salary for half killing myself running NICAP. It is something, Mr. Lord, there's not a person up there in an executive capacity, administrative capacity, that couldn't leave today and go somewhere else and do a lot better without carrying the worries. For instance, of being criticized by authors who don't like our review. No, I tell you, I'm going to talk with you later sometime about that, and I will publish Dr. McDonald's criticism, but I have no personal animosity, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but we owe you a tape recorder, I believe you mentioned, so you should get that back sometime, or a new one in place of it.
I didn't ask for it back.
I know, but we're going to give you a new one because it's been used, at least, but anyhow, that has nothing to do with it. Just, this could be considered a thankless job, I'll tell you that. And, but once you're in it, if you suddenly quit, everybody will say, well, see, he gave up, wasn't anything to it. So
You're hooked.
you're hooked. Yeah. You look out, you don't get hooked. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think you all had copies of the press release, which summed up the main points, and the copies of the letter.